The big question, raised partly by Jeff on the question of taxes, is there is a reason why we pool resources in this country. We are an extraordinarily unequal country, and we live in extraordinarily unequal parts of the country, where the difference between Liverpool and Woking is huge, and much more so than in other countries, Sweden or even Switzerland, where actually people are much more equal, and therefore it's quite a lot easier to decentralise. The danger of the idea of free councils, which Eric Pickles is now working on, where people can keep, where local councils can keep their business rates, is that the people who generate the business rates are all the rich areas, and the people who don't are all the poor areas. And so either it's not really true, they're not really going to be free councils, or else, because there will continue to be, as there should be, great redistribution, or there won't be, in which case we'll become an even more unequal country. I think we should remember that as the cuts have fallen 4 times harder on the poorer areas than on the richer areas, 4 times more in Liverpool than in Woking, Liverpool the worst, which is also the poorest. And that's the reality of a certain kind of localism that's going on at the moment. I think that localism can be a very handy method for shrinking the size of the state. State at the top, break it up, everybody hates centralism, we'll devolve the axe, you do it, and then we'll blame you. And we'll say local councils are dreadfully inefficient. We told them not to cut the front office, only to cut the back office, but if you've got to cut 27%, the idea that you've got 27% fat and bureaucracy is of course absurd. But it's a way of absolving elected central government from blame for decisions that central government have made. I don't think it's going to stick. The next thing that's coming along, David Cameron made a speech about it, happening in the NHS, now going to happen in all public services, is that any willing provider will be allowed to step forward and take over and bid for, have tendered out any part of the public sector. David Cameron made a speech about it, we've got a white paper on public services coming up. That means that locally, your local council, your local elected people, you yourselves may wish to keep your public service, but under European law, it will become the case that any private provider who wants to come along and cherry pick some bit of it and say you should put that out to tender, if they then win the tender, fair and square, you won't necessarily have the local choice to have a public service. You may have to have a Serco service or a Capita service. So the question about choice is quite important. Also accountability. To whom are a lot of the local services going to be accountable to? Free schools, academy schools, free hospitals, foundation hospitals. Who are they really accountable to? How do we get a democratic handle on those? Now these are the real hard questions about the conflict between apparent localism and pushing things out, control out from the centre, and it landing in places where there stops being any democratic control, whatever, or any democratic accountability for how they're run. I worry about NIMBYism. You say your bill in planning will not allow local NIMBYism. My suspicion is that in Surrey they won't be easily bribed to build a whole lot more houses, but we'll see. It's going to have to be a damn big bribe to get them to do it. And the places that that desperately need the money and might be willing to build, maybe places where don't need more houses and don't really need to build. I think the contempt about targets has been absurd. Targets actually worked rather well. Money and targets were quite a good system, brought down the NHS waiting lists very rapidly. Targets are not altogether a bad thing.
But they didn't work in the housing sector for the last government. I mean, targets were never...
No, it was an extraordinary market failure that at the time, and inexplicable, it was the workings of capitalism, that at a time of fantastic house price increase, where those of us who own houses were sitting in houses on average earning £50 a day just for sitting in the house you earned, somehow or another, the great building industry of ours failed to build. And it's extraordinary, and Kate Barker had some explanations of that, but not altogether. I think it remained something of a mystery. But yes, that was a failure. Certainly the target to build houses was a failure. But I just really want to end up by saying, look very carefully at good localism and bad localism. The sort of community organising that the Young Foundation does and that London Citizens does is fantastic. That's wonderful. Local real local engagement. I'm very suspicious about a certain kind of localism which puts power into the hands of a tiny group of unelected people, whoever they may be, whether they're just local interest groups or whatever. It's very easy, as with, say, residents' associations that don't really represent the whole of a council estate, but run it nonetheless. It's very easy to have bad forms of localism and bad forms of apparent local people running things, which is actually just small cartels. So I think I'll leave it at that.
That's terrific. I think what we've had is a rather telling joust about localism on a sort of philosophical and ideological level, with some specifics germane to the housing sector thrown in as well. And what I want to do, because I'm aware that many of you listening are going to be, having a stake in the housing sector, whether you be planners, whether you be involved in the building and construction industry, local authorities, whatever. I do now want to sort of unpick some of the ideas that you've rather wonderfully thrown out and make them relevant to the housing issue in particular. Because, Jeff nodded to it. Here's the reality. We sit in a nation of, roughly 61 million people, and within a generation we're going to be closer to 70 million people. We desperately need new houses. And over on this side of the issue, can I just ask, gentlemen, do you really believe that the localism that you've outlined today is going to deliver the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of new homes and new communities that this nation needs in fairly short order?
Well, first of all, you can't argue against localism in this area on the basis that centralism has worked. We are building fewer houses and have built fewer houses year by year since it became more centralised. And so, you can say it's a mystery as to why it did it, but and I think I could spend some time explaining why it did do it, and I do think I know why it did it, but the fact of the matter is, it didn't work, so we've got to do a different thing. And the first reason it didn't work was that you have a system whereby people feel that new housing is thrust upon them. That's the first problem. Secondly, we have become extremely unwilling to pay the price of development. I put down the word on my paper that the French know about bribery. The fact is the French get things done because what they say is it's cheaper to give people a stake in something than to go through all the court cases that you have to force things upon them. So I think the first thing is, if you do the incentives properly, you'll make that work effectively. And I do remember the way in which people tried to stop this before. Civil servants and Polly Toynbee always say better not. They always say, better not, Minister, there's a drawback. Yeah, there are a hell of a lot of drawbacks. But we know that the present system doesn't work, so let's try to make the new system work. The other thing I do want to say is about the problem of NIMBYism. See, NIMBYism has become one of those words, it's like cherry picking. You try to close the argument off. You say NIMBYism. Well, if NIMBYism means that people locally want to say that they want their community to grow in a particular way, and you want to change that, then I think you've got to make it worth their while. In other words, all right, if you're going to build here, then we will make sure there's proper, for example, proper infrastructure. We will make sure that the money comes back to the local community. You've got to do that.
Okay, but the point surely is that, particularly in the southeast of England, where most of the jobs are, where a lot of the national prosperity is, the NIMBYist element aren't saying, oh, well, we only want major new housing development with the proper infrastructure and we're worried you're not going to deliver it. They're saying we don't want new housing development at all, because the few rolling hills we've got left and the nice bit of nature we still have in our backyard, we want to keep, and we don't want any sort of development with infrastructure or without it. And that's why, without wishing to make the Toynbee case for Ms. Toynbee, when she points out that there's a huge difference between Woking and Liverpool and that a strategic overview is necessary, not devolving everything down, she has a point.
Yeah, but you're doing a hard talk trick there. You're swapping over two different things. Mm. First of all, you're saying that what people want to protect is the rolling hills and the beautiful country. So they jolly well should. We shouldn't be building on any of that. That is not an acceptable alternative. We should be rebuilding on old land which has already been used. And if you really want to take the previous government's plans, you see that they were going to build on 1/10 more land, which is a huge increase of new land. So you mustn't do that. You've got to encourage people, which we've never done. That's one of the reasons we didn't build houses. You've got to make it possible for them to build on brownfield sites. And you've also got to have tough figures about how many they have to build. So you don't say to them, you can build none if you don't want to. That's part of the law will not let them do that. But what you will enable them to do is to have the resources to build on the sites they ought to be building on, not in the middle of green fields and depriving the next generation of the environment that most of us have been trying to fight for all this time. The NIMBYism of the kind that protects the green fields, thank God for it, and we want more of it.
All right, so in that sense, the case is NIMBYism in particular, if we're focused now on housing and how to deliver the new housing the country needs, is actually not the problem. Panelists, other panelists, agree, disagree?
Well, all I want to add to what John was saying is no one said, and I was very careful what I said about the forces that interact with the development of housing in this country, but the fact is we do need to find a different way in that gets local communities and local places to both A, recognise they can shape and determine when the housing is built, if through negotiation. I mean, plan making in its best, Jeff, actually is about negotiation and about community involvement, actually giving people an opportunity to decide where the development takes place, making it clear what are the benefits that come back to that neighbourhood, not just that local authority, for the benefits of that development. So you're getting a shift. It's like it's behavioural economics. But will it happen to do just one thing? Will it solve all of the issues about getting more homes built? No, it will not, and no one has ever said that. You have to pitch that alongside both other aspects of planning policy. You have to then connect that to the issues around the credit markets, about our over-reliance on debt, about the way that we both regulate our mortgages, the way we encourage others to grow the private rental sector. It's a very complex set of issues that build you a housing market.
Right.
Can I ask him a question?
Well,
am I right in thinking that quite a lot of housing has actually been cancelled due to the change in the way that planning is going to happen now?